A search and rescue team recovered a mud-covered camcorder beside an abandoned fire tower deep inside Black Pine Hollow. The final recording showed 6 seconds of frantic movement, a voice whispering Elias Crowe's name from the darkness, and a scream cut short mid-breath. The footage ended before anyone appeared on screen, and that was the last time anyone heard from them. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Now turn off the lights, and let's begin. The camcorder should not have been there. Ranger Daniel Mercer stood beneath the abandoned fire tower and stared at the device half buried in wet mud. The soil looked freshly disturbed. Thick clumps still clung to the cracked lens. But the weather records showed no rainfall for 5 days. Daniel crouched beside it and touched the ground carefully, unsettled by what that suggested. He carried the camera back to the ranger station before sunset. The battery was nearly dead. Most of the footage was corrupted. Static swallowed entire sections. But between the interference, brief images appeared. Trees flashed past. A shaky flashlight beam cut through darkness. Then something stranger appeared. Structures. Small buildings hidden among the pines where no buildings should have existed. Daniel replayed the sequence 3 times. "Pause it there," said Deputy Harris. The frame froze on a shape behind the trees. It looked like a rooftop, maybe several rooftops. The image quality was terrible. Yet neither man could explain why someone had built structures that deep inside protected forest land. The silence in the room lingered longer than either expected. The camcorder belonged to Elias Crowe. That discovery came later that evening. His name was scratched onto the battery compartment. A missing persons report had already been filed. Elias was a freelance photographer from Oregon. According to the report, nobody had heard from him in nearly a week. The timing made Daniel's stomach tighten with growing concern. The next morning, they located Elias's truck. It sat beside a locked forest access road nearly 12 miles from the fire tower. Dust coated the windshield. Fallen pine needles covered the hood. Nothing appeared disturbed. His camera bags remained inside. His wallet was still in the glove compartment. It looked less like someone had left voluntarily and more like they had simply failed to return. Daniel searched the surrounding area with 2 volunteers. They found boot prints leading toward Black Pine Hollow. Then the tracks disappeared. Not gradually. Not because of rocky terrain. They simply stopped in the middle of soft earth. One volunteer stared at the ground for several seconds before stepping backward. Nobody could explain where Elias had gone after that point. News spread quickly through nearby communities. When Daniel mentioned Black Pine Hollow during interviews, people reacted strangely. Some ended conversations immediately. Others claimed they knew nothing. One elderly woman dropped a box she was carrying when she heard the name. Her hands trembled visibly. When Daniel asked what was wrong, she shook her head and hurried away without another word. That night, Daniel reviewed the footage again. A burst of static filled the screen. White noise crackled through the speakers. Then, for less than a second, another image appeared. A weathered wooden sign stood among thick vegetation. Most of the lettering was hidden. Only a few faded characters remained visible. Daniel leaned closer to the monitor. Before he could study it further, the image vanished beneath another wave of interference. The following afternoon, he visited the county archives. Old records filled dusty cabinets nobody had opened in years. While searching historic forestry documents, he discovered a folded survey map dated 1958. Near the center of Black Pine Hollow, a small settlement was marked in faded ink. Several roads led toward it. A name had once been written there, but someone had deliberately scratched it out. Daniel compared the map against every modern version available. The settlement no longer existed on any of them. No explanation accompanied its disappearance. No relocation records existed. No mention appeared in county development files. It was as if an entire community had been removed from history. As Daniel stared at the erased location, he noticed something else. A fresh fingerprint smudged the edge of the map, as though someone had examined it very recently. Then the station phone rang. When Daniel answered, nobody spoke. Only faint static came through the receiver. He was about to hang up when a whisper emerged from the noise. A single sentence. Quiet, careful, almost afraid. Stop looking for the town before it notices you. The line went dead immediately afterward. The fingerprint on the map should not have been fresh. Daniel stood alone in the archive room after the call ended. The building was locked. Nobody else had entered for hours. Yet the smudge remained on the paper. He compared it with his own hand. It was smaller, recent. Someone had touched the map after it was removed from storage, and the warning still echoed in his mind with disturbing uncertainty. The next morning, investigators requested historical aerial photographs. Most of the images showed endless forest stretching across Black Pine Hollow. Then they found a survey flight from 1974. Daniel spread the photograph across a table and felt the room grow quiet. Dozens of buildings stood in the center of the hollow. Streets were visible. Roofs reflected sunlight. It looked like a living town. Yet nobody could find any record explaining where it had gone. Deputy Harris frowned at the image. That's too big to disappear. Nobody disagreed. The town occupied several acres. There were houses, a church, and what appeared to be a small school. Even stranger, later aerial surveys showed nothing but trees. No demolition scars. No foundations. No roads. It was as if the settlement had been erased between photographs, leaving only questions behind. The county archive held another surprise. A file index listed an entire folder dedicated to the settlement. The folder number existed. The references existed. But when archivists searched the storage shelves, the documents were gone. Not misplaced. Removed. Several checkout logs had been torn directly from the record book, leaving ragged paper edges and growing suspicion. Daniel began asking older residents for answers. Most refused to speak. One retired surveyor finally agreed to meet. His name was Walter Briggs. He was 82 years old and lived alone outside town. The moment Daniel showed him the aerial photograph, color drained from his face. He stared at the image for several seconds before looking toward the window, as if checking whether something might be watching. "I've been there," Walter said quietly. The room fell silent. Walter claimed he visited the settlement in the late 1960s while conducting land surveys. He remembered houses, people, vehicles parked along the roads. Yet years later, he returned to update his measurements and found nothing. No buildings. No debris. Not even foundations. His voice trembled as he described walking through trees where an entire street had supposedly stood. "What happened to it?" Daniel asked. Walter hesitated. Then he shook his head. "That's the problem," he whispered. "I don't remember." The answer unsettled Daniel more than any ghost story could have. Walter remembered names of coworkers, weather conditions, equipment serial numbers. Yet every memory connected to the settlement seemed damaged. He described it like pages torn from a book. Entire conversations were missing, faces blurred in his mind. The harder he tried to recall details, the more uncomfortable he became, and something about that felt deeply wrong. That evening, Daniel returned to the recovered camcorder footage. Digital specialists had restored several corrupted sections. Most contained meaningless static. But hidden between damaged frames were clearer glimpses of the forest. During one sequence, the rusted sign appeared again. This time more of it was visible. Beneath layers of vines and moss stood faded lettering welcoming visitors to a place that supposedly never existed. Then another discovery emerged. The technician froze the footage. A blurred human figure stood between distant trees. First, nobody thought much of it. The image quality was poor. The person could have been anyone. But as additional footage was restored, the same figure appeared again. And again. Different locations. Different times of day. Yet always standing in exactly the same posture, creating growing unease. The technician enlarged several frames. Nobody spoke while comparing them. The figure never moved. Arms at its sides. Head slightly tilted. Distance varied, but the position remained identical. One frame showed Elias filming near a creek. Another placed him beside a rocky ridge. Yet the figure occupied the same relative stance every single time, deepening the mystery. "That's impossible," Harris finally muttered. Daniel agreed. The timestamps proved the recordings were captured hours apart. Some locations were miles from one another. No person could appear in every scene without moving. Yet frame after frame suggested exactly that. The stillness of the figure felt less natural with each discovery, and nobody wanted to speculate why. Near midnight, Daniel examined one final restored sequence. Elias was breathing heavily behind the camera. Branches snapped somewhere nearby. The flashlight beam shook violently. For a brief moment, the mysterious figure appeared closer than before. Much closer. The image lasted less than a second before static consumed the screen. But that was enough, because for the first time they could see its face. And the face wasn't blurred at all. It was Elias Crowe staring directly back at his own camera from the darkness behind him. Daniel watched the frame 3 times before speaking. The face behind Elias was unmistakable. Same beard, same jacket, same features. Yet the timestamp placed the image several days before his disappearance. Elias could not have been standing behind himself. The room remained silent except for the low hum of computer equipment and the growing fear that none of them understood what they were looking at. Deputy Harris finally pushed away from the table. "No," that was all he said. But Daniel understood. They were both thinking the same thing. Either the footage had been manipulated, or something impossible had been following Elias through Black Pine Hollow. Neither explanation felt remotely comforting as uncertainty settled over the room. 2 days later, Daniel received a call from a man who refused to give his name. The caller claimed he had information about the hollow. He agreed to meet only after dark and only if no cameras were present. His voice sounded strained. Every few seconds he paused, as though listening for something outside the line. Before hanging up, he added a warning that left Daniel uneasy. "Don't bring recording equipment." The meeting took place inside an abandoned maintenance shed. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The stranger arrived wearing a faded ranger uniform jacket. He kept his hood low and chose a chair facing away from the windows. Even after Daniel introduced himself, the man refused to show his face. The behavior felt excessive until the conversation began revealing disturbing details. "I worked Black Pine Hollow for 11 years, the man said. His voice was rough. "People disappear there." Daniel waited. The former ranger described decades of missing hikers, hunters, campers, survey crews, search teams. Many cases shared the same strange pattern. Personal belongings were recovered. Vehicles remained untouched. Trails ended abruptly. Witnesses reported hearing voices shortly before victims vanished. The similarities felt too precise to dismiss, creating deeper suspicion. "What kind of voices?" Daniel asked. The ranger lowered his head. "Familiar ones." A long silence followed. The ranger explained that rescuers often heard friends calling from impossible distances. Some heard family members. Others heard missing persons they were actively searching for. The voices always sounded believable, always close enough to follow. And almost every time someone pursued them alone, they disappeared as well. Daniel felt a chill run through him. Archived reports supported the claims. Over the following days, investigators uncovered old radio transcripts stored in emergency communication records. Several transmissions described rescuers hearing their names called from deep inside the forest. The distances never made sense. Some voices appeared miles away from known locations. Others seemed to move through the woods faster than any person could travel. One transmission stood out. The recording came from 1987. A search coordinator calmly reported hearing his wife calling for help from somewhere north of his position. The problem was simple. His wife was at home over 40 miles away. Witnesses stated he followed the voice anyway. Minutes later, radio contact ended permanently, leaving only unanswered questions. The former ranger revealed something even stranger. During one search operation, he discovered a trail of fresh footprints crossing a clearing. The prints appeared normal at first. Heavy boots, adult size. Then they stopped. Not at a road. Not near rocks. Not near water. They ended in open ground beneath clear daylight, creating a contradiction nobody could explain. "We dug there," he said quietly. Daniel leaned forward. The ranger's hands trembled. "We thought there might be a sinkhole. There wasn't." "No." The footprints simply ended. Investigators excavated several feet into the soil. They found nothing beneath the final print. No tunnel. No cave. No evidence whatsoever. The ranger admitted he still dreamed about the discovery decades later. Something about those tracks convinced him the hollow operated by rules nobody understood. The interview stretched late into the evening. Then the ranger became noticeably nervous. His attention shifted repeatedly toward the door. He checked the windows twice. Several times he stopped speaking mid-sentence, listening carefully to sounds Daniel could not hear. The growing tension felt contagious. Even the air inside the shed seemed heavier as an ominous implication settled over the conversation. Finally, the ranger stood. "I shouldn't have come." Daniel rose with him. "Wait, there's more, isn't there?" The man hesitated. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he revealed the one detail he had avoided all night. Deep inside Black Pine Hollow stood an observation tower abandoned by federal authorities decades earlier. The structure had once monitored unusual activity throughout the forest. Officially, it was closed due to budget cuts. According to the ranger, that explanation was a lie. "What really happened?" Daniel asked. The ranger stared toward the darkness beyond the rain-streaked window. His answer came barely above a whisper. Something climbed into view beneath the tower. Before Daniel could ask another question, the ranger opened the door and disappeared into the night. The next morning, investigators returned to the maintenance shed, hoping to locate him again. The chair where he had been sitting remained untouched. But scratched into the dusty tabletop were 6 words nobody remembered seeing before. "It still walks below the tower." And beneath the message lay a fresh set of muddy fingerprints that had not been there the night before. The muddy fingerprints were still wet. Daniel stared at them while the morning sun filtered through the shed windows. Nobody had entered after the interview. At least nobody was supposed to have entered. Yet the prints glistened against the dusty tabletop. One investigator touched the edge carefully. The mud smeared instantly. Someone had been inside recently, leaving behind a warning that deepened the mystery. By noon, the team located the observation tower. It stood nearly 15 miles inside Black Pine Hollow. Rusted fencing surrounded the structure. Sections had collapsed years earlier. Faded federal warning signs hung crooked from metal posts. Most were unreadable. The few remaining words simply stated that entry was prohibited. Nobody could find any explanation for why the restriction still existed. The forest felt wrong around the tower. No birds called from the trees. No insects buzzed nearby. Even the wind seemed strangely absent. Daniel noticed the silence immediately. Several investigators exchanged nervous glances but continued forward. The stillness was so complete that every footstep sounded unnaturally loud, feeding a growing sense of isolation. The tower itself remained standing. Barely. Steel supports groaned softly as they climbed. Rust covered nearly every surface. The upper observation room had been sealed with heavy chains decades earlier, but someone had already cut through them. Fresh bolt marks gleamed against older corrosion. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. They were not the first people to visit recently. Inside, the room looked abandoned at first glance. Then someone aimed a flashlight at the walls. Dates covered nearly every surface. Hundreds of them. Some were carved deeply into the metal. Others appeared written with markers, paint, or charcoal. Daniel moved closer and felt a knot form in his stomach. Many dates matched known disappearances inside Black Pine Hollow. The pattern was impossible to ignore, creating unsettling questions. "Who wrote these?" Harris asked. Nobody answered. Near several dates were initials, names, small notes. Most had faded beyond recognition. Others remained disturbingly clear. One entry matched a hiker who vanished in 1998. Another belonged to a search volunteer lost in 2007. It looked less like graffiti and more like a record someone had carefully maintained. Then they found the cabinet. It stood hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit. The steel door was locked, but age had weakened the hinges. After several minutes, investigators forced it open. Dust exploded into the air. Inside sat dozens of film reels stacked in neat rows. None appeared catalogued. No inventory numbers existed. No official records mentioned them. Daniel carried the reels downstairs. Several hours later, they managed to view the footage. The earliest recordings showed surveillance cameras positioned around the hollow. Most captured empty forest. Then stranger scenes emerged. People wandered through the woods at night. Men, women, teenagers. Every individual appeared focused on something unseen beyond the camera frame, increasing the sense of dread. One reel drew immediate attention. A family stood beside a campsite. The footage contained no audio, but investigators could read their reactions. At first they appeared relaxed. Then all four suddenly turned toward the trees. Their expressions changed instantly. One by one, they began walking into the darkness. Nobody resisted. Nobody ran. They simply followed whatever had called to them, leaving disturbing implications. Another reel showed search and rescue personnel. Daniel watched carefully. The rescuers paused near a ridgeline. Several looked confused. One man pointed into the distance. Moments later, the group split apart despite standard protocol. Individuals wandered in different directions through dense forest. The footage ended before any returned. Their disappearance records matched the date on the reel. As darkness fell outside the station, investigators loaded the final reel. The image quality was poor. Static flickered constantly across the screen. A timestamp indicated the recording came from the observation tower itself. Cameras monitored the surrounding forest from multiple angles. For several minutes, nothing unusual appeared. Then movement emerged beneath the tower. At first it looked like a shadow passing between trees, but something felt wrong. The shape continued moving. Too smoothly, too quickly. It crossed one camera view and entered another almost instantly. Investigators froze the frame repeatedly, trying to identify what they were seeing. Every image seemed different. In one frame it appeared tall. In another it seemed low to the ground. The contradictions made no sense, creating growing paranoia. Then every camera reacted at once. Static erupted across all screens simultaneously. The recordings distorted violently. For less than a second, a dark figure stood directly beneath the tower looking upward. Nobody could identify a face. Nobody could estimate a height. The image seemed to resist focus itself. Then every camera failed at the exact same moment, leaving only blank screens and terrifying uncertainty. The reel ended there. No explanation followed. No reports accompanied the footage. Nothing in the tower records mentioned what happened afterward. Yet tucked inside the empty reel case, Daniel discovered a folded sheet of paper. The document contained a rough hand-drawn map of the tower grounds. One location had been circled repeatedly in red ink, directly beneath the tower. And beside the circle, someone had written 3 words that changed everything. "There is a door." The words looked hurried. Daniel held the paper beneath a desk lamp and studied the faded ink. The handwriting changed midway through the sentence, as if the writer's hand had begun shaking. Multiple lines circled the same location beneath the observation tower. There were no instructions, no names, just a warning pointing towards something hidden underground, leaving dangerous uncertainty. The team returned to the tower before sunrise. Fog drifted between the trees. The silence remained unnatural. Nobody spoke much during the hike. Every creak of equipment seemed louder than normal. Daniel noticed several investigators glancing over their shoulders without explanation. The feeling of being watched had settled over the group, and nobody wanted to admit it. Finding the entrance took hours. They searched the tower foundation carefully. Rusted beams and collapsed debris surrounded the structure. Then Harris discovered a steel ring hidden beneath a layer of dirt and pine needles. Everyone froze. The ring was attached to a heavy metal hatch. Fresh scrape marks crossed the surface, suggesting someone had opened it recently. The trapdoor resisted at first. Then it groaned upward. Cold air rushed from the darkness below. The temperature change was immediate. Daniel felt goosebumps rise across his arms. A narrow staircase descended into blackness beneath the tower. No official blueprints mentioned underground construction. Yet the hidden entrance stretched downward as if it had always been there, deepening the mystery. Their flashlights revealed concrete walls. The stairwell continued farther than expected. 30 feet, then 40. The deeper they traveled, the older the structure appeared. Water stains covered the walls. Rusted conduits ran overhead. Eventually the staircase opened into a corridor lined with heavy steel doors. Most stood partially open. Dust coated the floor, but not evenly. Some areas looked recently disturbed, creating growing suspicion. What was this place? Harris asked. Nobody knew. The underground complex resembled a monitoring station abandoned decades earlier. Rows of equipment filled several rooms. Control panels blinked faintly despite no visible power source. Ancient monitors hummed softly in the darkness. Daniel touched one screen and quickly pulled his hand away. The glass felt warm, an unsettling contradiction. One room contained recording equipment. Hundreds of machines stood silent. Reel-to-reel systems, audio consoles, signal analyzers. Much of the technology appeared outdated by decades. Yet indicator lights flickered across multiple devices. A low electrical buzz echoed through the chamber. The facility should have been dead. Instead, it felt dormant, as though waiting for someone to return. Then they found the tapes. Shelves stretched across an entire wall. Each tape carried a handwritten label. Names. Dozens of names. Then hundreds. Investigators moved carefully along the rows, reading them one by one. Many matched known missing persons from Black Pine Hollow. Some dated back 50 years. Others were recent. Every shelf seemed dedicated to people who had vanished without explanation, raising disturbing questions. Daniel removed one tape at random. The label belonged to a missing hunter from 1989. After several minutes, they managed to play the recording. A man's voice filled the room. He sounded calm, relaxed. He appeared to be speaking with someone nearby. Yet only one voice was captured. The conversation continued naturally for several minutes before abruptly ending mid-sentence, creating ominous uncertainty. Another tape produced similar results. Then another, and another. Each recording featured a missing person speaking casually to someone unheard. Some laughed. Some asked questions. Several sounded comforted. Every recording ended the same way. A sentence interrupted. A sudden silence. Then nothing. The pattern felt deliberate, feeding growing dread. Hours passed before Daniel found a familiar label. His hand froze instantly. Elias Crowe. The room became silent. Nobody moved as he loaded the tape into an aging recorder. Static crackled softly. Then Elias's voice emerged from the speaker. Calm, clear, completely recognizable. He described hiking conditions, camera settings, landmarks. Everything sounded ordinary until investigators checked the date written on the label. The recording shouldn't have existed. It was dated 9 days before Elias entered Black Pine Hollow. Daniel replayed the date repeatedly. There was no mistake. According to phone records, GPS logs, and witness statements, Elias had still been hundreds of miles away at that time. Yet the voice on the tape clearly belonged to him. More disturbing still, Elias seemed to be responding to someone speaking just outside microphone range, creating impossible implications. Then the final minute began. Elias fell quiet. For several seconds, only faint background noise remained. Then he laughed softly, as though someone had told him a joke. His next words caused every investigator in the room to stare at one another in alarm. How do you know I'll come here next week? Pause followed. Elias listened carefully. Then his breathing changed. Not frightened, not confused, almost convinced. The tape ended before any answer could be heard. Nobody spoke afterward. The underground facility felt different now. Less abandoned, less forgotten. Someone had recorded Elias before he ever arrived. Someone had known he was coming. As Daniel stared into the darkness beyond the equipment room, he noticed a narrow corridor extending deeper underground than any blueprint should have allowed. And somewhere far beyond the reach of their flashlights, a voice quietly called his name. The voice sounded close, too close. Daniel turned immediately and swept his flashlight down the corridor. The beam revealed concrete walls, rusted pipes, and empty darkness. Nothing moved. Nobody stood there. Yet he knew what he had heard. Several investigators looked at him with concern, and their reactions made it clear they had heard it too. "Did somebody say that?" Harris asked. Nobody answered. The corridor remained silent. Then the voice came again. "Daniel." A little farther away this time. The sound seemed to drift through the underground tunnels without direction. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something about the familiarity unsettled him immediately. The speaker sounded calm, patient, as though waiting for him to follow, creating dangerous uncertainty. The team continued deeper underground. The passage narrowed as they advanced. Their footsteps echoed strangely through the concrete maze. Several intersections branched into darkness. Old utility signs hung crooked on the walls. Some corridors appeared collapsed. Others disappeared beyond heavy steel doors. The deeper they traveled, the stronger the feeling became that someone else was nearby. Then the recording equipment began acting strangely. One investigator carried a digital audio recorder. Without warning, it activated itself. Nobody had touched it. The device displayed a recording time already in progress. Confused, the investigator stopped the file and played it back. What emerged from the speaker caused everyone to freeze, increasing the tension instantly. It was their conversation, not the current one. A different conversation. The voices belonged to the team, but nobody remembered speaking those words. The recording captured detailed discussions about rooms they had not yet entered. It described equipment they had not yet discovered. Every sentence sounded authentic. Every voice was real. Yet the conversation should not have existed. The corridor descended further. The air grew colder. Moisture collected along the walls. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead. Daniel noticed several candle stubs sitting in wall recesses. Fresh wax had pooled beneath them. He crouched beside one and touched the surface. It was soft. Someone had been here recently, creating growing suspicion. "Maybe squatters," one investigator whispered. Nobody believed it. The tunnels stretched too deep, too isolated, too hidden. And there was something unsettling about the candle placement. They formed a trail leading farther underground. Every few yards another appeared. The arrangement looked deliberate, almost ceremonial. Daniel followed them carefully, unable to shake the feeling that they were being guided somewhere dangerous. A sharp voice suddenly echoed behind them. Daniel spun around. His flashlight shook. The corridor was empty, but another investigator stood frozen in place. His name was Michael. His face had gone pale. His breathing grew rapid. For several seconds he stared at a sealed concrete wall as though listening to something beyond it, creating immediate fear. "Michael!" No response. The others approached cautiously. Then Michael raised a trembling hand toward the wall. "My brother," he whispered. The room fell silent. Michael's brother had died in a car accident 6 years earlier. Everyone on the team knew that. Yet Michael insisted he could hear him speaking clearly from the other side of the concrete. His eyes filled with tears. The voice continued calling softly. Familiar, gentle, impossible. Daniel grabbed his shoulder. "We need to keep moving." Michael hesitated. The voice called again. For a terrifying moment, Daniel thought he might run toward the wall. Instead, Michael lowered his head and stepped away. Nobody spoke afterward. The emotional strain hung heavily over the group. Whatever existed beneath Black Pine Hollow understood exactly what people wanted to hear. The candles eventually led them to a hidden chamber. A rusted metal door stood partially open. The room beyond was larger than expected. Dust covered the floor. Old furniture sat against the walls. Someone had clearly lived there at some point. Blankets, food containers, water supplies, most appeared recent. The discovery transformed fear into a more disturbing realization. Someone was still using the tunnels. Recently, perhaps even now, investigators searched the chamber carefully. Near the back wall, Harris discovered several wooden boxes stacked beneath a tarp. Inside were hundreds of photographs organized into bundles. At first they seemed ordinary. Then Daniel looked closer. Every image depicted a missing person connected to Black Pine Hollow, creating growing dread. The dates made no sense. One photograph showed a missing camper from 1994. Another featured a hunter who vanished in 2008. Several victims were smiling. Others appeared frightened. But every image shared the same impossible detail. They had all been taken after the individuals officially disappeared. In some cases, years after. The timestamps printed along the edges made that horrifyingly clear. Then Daniel found Elias. The photograph rested near the bottom of a box. Elias stood beside a building Daniel did not recognize. He looked tired but alive. The date printed on the image was 4 days after his disappearance. Several investigators exchanged nervous glances. The implications were impossible to ignore, leaving terrifying uncertainty. A sound echoed from deeper within the chamber. Not a voice. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Approaching from a tunnel hidden beyond the rear wall. The team raised their flashlights toward the darkness. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The footsteps stopped immediately. For several seconds, absolute silence filled the underground room. Then a camera flash illuminated the tunnel. Someone had just taken their photograph from the darkness. The flash lasted less than a second. Yet every investigator saw it. A burst of white light erupted from the hidden tunnel. Then darkness returned immediately. Daniel raised his flashlight and rushed forward. Harris followed close behind. The others hesitated only briefly before joining them. Whoever had taken the photograph was nearby, creating dangerous uncertainty. The tunnel beyond the chamber was narrow. Concrete eventually gave way to rough stone. The deeper they moved, the older everything appeared. Strange markings covered sections of the walls. Some looked like survey notes. Others resembled symbols scratched into the rock repeatedly over decades. Daniel noticed dozens of names among them. Every few yards, another disappeared person's name emerged from the darkness. Then the tunnel opened. A massive chamber stretched before them. Several investigators stopped walking. The room was far larger than anything expected beneath the observation tower. Thick support columns rose into shadows beyond flashlight range. Ancient cables crossed the ceiling. Rusted equipment occupied raised platforms around the perimeter. The place looked like a forgotten government installation buried beneath the forest. "What is this?" Harris whispered. Nobody knew. Rows of machinery filled the chamber. Some devices appeared decades old. Others seemed even older. Dust covered most surfaces. Yet faint electrical sounds echoed throughout the room. Indicator lights blinked softly in distant corners. The entire facility should have been powerless. Instead, it felt active in ways nobody could explain. Daniel approached a control console. A monitor suddenly flickered to life. Everyone jumped. Static rolled across the screen. Then text appeared. Not computer code. Not diagnostics. A list of names. Hundreds of them. The names scrolled slowly upward through the static, creating growing dread. Daniel immediately recognized several victims from Black Pine Hollow investigations. The list continued. Year after year. Decade after decade. Missing hikers. Campers. Search volunteers. Surveyors. Children. Entire families. The names filled screen after screen. Nobody spoke as they watched the impossible archive moving before them. It looked less like a database and more like a record someone had been carefully maintaining for generations. Then another discovery emerged. A steel filing cabinet stood against a nearby wall. The drawers contained faded government reports. Most were heavily damaged. Some pages had been deliberately removed. Yet enough remained to reveal fragments of a disturbing story. Several documents referenced unexplained radio transmissions originating beneath Black Pine Hollow, creating deeper suspicion. One report drew immediate attention. It was dated 1968. The paper described recurring broadcasts detected throughout the region. The transmissions carried no known source identification. Signal strength fluctuated unpredictably. Most disturbing of all, operators reported hearing names spoken through the broadcasts. Names belonging to people who later disappeared. The report ended abruptly. No conclusions. No recommendations. Only a handwritten note. Do not respond. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Nearby, Harris discovered another room. The door opened reluctantly. Inside stood radio equipment unlike anything else in the facility. Large transmission units lined the walls. Tangled wiring crossed the floor. Most components appeared ancient, yet several indicator lights glowed steadily. Against all logic, the equipment seemed operational, increasing the sense of unease. Then the speakers activated. Without warning, a burst of static filled the room. Several investigators flinched. The noise continued for nearly 10 seconds. Then a voice emerged. Calm, clear, human. It spoke a single name. After a brief pause, another followed. Then another. The pattern continued relentlessly, creating growing fear. The broadcast was reading names. Hundreds of names. Slowly, methodically. Every name belonged to someone connected to Black Pine Hollow. Missing persons. Witnesses. Search teams. Residents. Daniel listened in silence as decades of disappearances passed through the speakers. The voice never changed. Never hesitated. It sounded as though it had been repeating the list forever. Then Daniel heard something worse. His own name. The room froze. Nobody moved. The broadcast continued. One by one, the names of every investigator present echoed through the speakers. Harris, Michael, Daniel, every member of the team. Several people instinctively stepped backward. Others stared at the equipment as panic began replacing curiosity. The transmission should have ended. Instead, another sound emerged. A response. Faint at first, then clearer. Voices answered from somewhere beneath the station. The investigators looked toward the floor. The replies were coming from below. Not through the radio. Not through the speakers. From deep beneath the earth itself. The chamber fell silent except for the exchange. The broadcast spoke another name. Something below answered. Again. And again. The voices underneath sounded human. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Some sounded young. Others old. Several were impossible to hear clearly. Yet one detail united them all. Every response carried the same distant quality, as though the speakers stood impossibly far away and terrifyingly close at the same time. Then one voice rose above the others, clearer than the rest. Daniel felt his blood run cold. He recognized it instantly. It belonged to Elias Crowe. The missing photographer sounded calm, almost cheerful. And before the transmission cut into static once more, Elias spoke a sentence that left the entire team staring into the darkness beneath their feet. "We've been waiting for you to come down." The voices beneath the station did not stop. They kept repeating Elias Crowe's name in uneven waves of static and breath. Daniel stood frozen for a moment longer than he should have. Then he looked at the others. Nobody spoke. Nobody gave an order. They simply turned toward the darkest corridor leading deeper underground, as if something had already decided for them. The final tunnel was narrower than the rest. Concrete gave way to raw stone again. The air grew heavier with every step. Flashlights revealed scratches across the walls, not random, but layered. Names carved over names, dates over dates, as if generations of people had been recording their presence in the same confined place, slowly turning the stone into an archive of disappearance. Then the tunnel opened without warning. The chamber beyond was impossible in scale. Their lights could not find the ceiling. The walls stretched farther than any underground structure should allow. Yet there were no support beams, no visible engineering, only darkness expanding outward, swallowing flashlight beams before they reached meaning. Harris whispered that it shouldn't exist. Nobody disagreed because disagreement required certainty. The walls were covered in names, thousands of them, Some were fresh, some deeply eroded. Elias Crowe appeared multiple times, carved in different handwriting, as if written by different hands across different years. Daniel ran his fingers over one of the markings. The stone beneath it felt warm, which made no sense underground, and nobody wanted to explain why. In the center of the chamber sat a pile of objects. Cameras, radios, backpacks, flashlights, personal belongings stacked in uneven layers, some corroded, others disturbingly intact. Daniel recognized brands from decades apart. A pocket watch still ticked softly near the bottom of the pile. Something about it suggested the pile had been growing, not abandoned, but collected. Then they found the storage cards, hundreds of them, neatly arranged inside a sealed metal box, each labeled with dates and names. One tag read, Elias Crowe, Final Capture. Daniel's hands hesitated before touching it. The others stepped back slightly. The silence in the chamber felt aware now, like it was waiting for the decision. Finally, he inserted the card into a portable reader. The device flickered immediately, as if recognizing something it should not have. The file loaded in fragments. Not all at once. 6 seconds. Corrupted. Recovered. Then stabilized. The team gathered behind him as the screen brightened. At first, only darkness filled the frame. Then slow movement. A camera shaking violently. Breath audible. Footsteps circling something unseen. The recording felt too close, as if the camera itself was being carried through something watching back. A shape appeared in the darkness. Then another. Then several more. Standing motionless just beyond the edge of the light. Human silhouettes filled the chamber in impossible numbers. None moved. None spoke. Yet every figure faced the camera at once, as if they had been waiting for that exact moment to be seen again. The air in the real chamber grew colder as Daniel watched them tilt their heads in perfect synchronization. Then Elias's voice came through the recording. Calm. Close. Already aware. You finally made it down here. The silhouettes in the footage stepped forward together. In the real chamber, something answered back in the dark behind them. And for the first time, Daniel understood the carved names were not records of who had been lost. The moment stretched longer than it should have. The chamber did not react immediately. No movement. No sound. Just the cold pressure of being seen by something that had already decided they were part of it. Then the tick of the pocket watch stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Daniel noticed it first. He looked down at the pile of objects in the center of the chamber. The watch that had been softly ticking a moment ago now sat frozen. Every other sound in the room seemed to sharpen in response, like silence itself had just tightened around them. Harris stepped back. Did anyone else hear? He stopped mid-sentence, because the recording device in Daniel's hand was still running. Even though no one had touched it, the screen flickered again. New footage. Same camera. But the angle had changed. It was no longer showing what they were holding. It was showing them, from somewhere inside the chamber. Daniel slowly lowered his real camera. In the footage, he did the same thing a second later. A delay. Perfect delay. Not random. Not glitching. Mirroring. Michael whispered, "That's not Liv." But his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. The silhouettes in the recording did not move, but their heads tilted slightly, in sync, like they were listening to something behind the real chamber, something none of the investigators had turned toward yet. A sound came from the darkness behind Daniel. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow. Measured. Close enough that it did not echo. Harris turned first. His flashlight beam cut into the black behind them. Nothing visible. But the beam did not behave normally. It bent slightly at the edge, like it was being pulled, like something was standing just outside reflection range. Then Elias Crowe's voice came again. Not from the device. Not from the recording. From the chamber itself. You're already inside it. Daniel stepped backward without thinking. His heel hit one of the scattered objects. A radio. Turned on immediately, even though it had no power source. A burst of static filled the chamber. Then multiple voices layered underneath it. Not just Elias, Dozens, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in broken synchronization. Some were whispering names. Some were laughing softly. Some were repeating phrases that overlapped until meaning collapsed completely. Michael suddenly dropped to his knees. He was staring at the wall, but his eyes weren't focused on it. They were focused slightly past it, like he was seeing something embedded behind the stone. "I can see them," he said quietly. Harris grabbed him. "See what?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Then he spoke again. "They're waiting in the wrong direction." The flashlight beam across the chamber flickered. Once, twice, then stabilized. But something had changed. The carved names on the walls were no longer static. Some of them looked freshly cut again, as if being rewritten in real time. Daniel felt something shift behind him. Not movement, position, like the space itself had adjusted. The silhouettes from the recording were no longer only on the screen. They were also in the chamber. Not fully visible, not fully absent, just present enough to be undeniable. And then Elias spoke one final time, very close, right behind Daniel's ear. "You should not have played the last 6 seconds." The flashlight died, all at once, and in the complete darkness that followed, every carved name on the walls lit up faintly, like something underneath the stone had just opened its eyes. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more horror stories like this. And let me know in the comments what you think really happened out there.